All right, next up is Cassidy. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Okay, so here are your aperture images. What a sweet dog. Oh. So the first one at f1.8, so quite large aperture, and then the second at f22, so huge, really quite a difference there. And we can certainly see, the difference in the depth of field. Each image works well. Again, many portrait photographers, or a number of portrait photographers, like to use shallow depth of field to isolate the subject from background information. Both images work very well, and definitely well for the assignment. So here is distance from subject. Great angle of view, great vantage point, this one especially. So further away from the subject and then closer in, and you can certainly see that the depth of field is shallow here, and the treat is the point of focus, with the dog just kind of looking up at it. So great job. And focal length of lens. So here we have an 85 millimeter lens, and then 35. So 85 being mildly telephoto, and 35 in the normal range. We could definitely see a difference in the depth of field when the longer portion of the lens is used here. So great job. Thank you, Cassidy. All right, Jessica. Excuse me. Some lovely images. I'm not quite sure you understood the assignment completely. Let's take a look. So here in the aperture images, both images are beautiful, but you didn't change the aperture. So it looks as if you changed your distance from the subject. But for aperture, you need to just change the aperture, keeping the distance from the subject and the focal length of the lens the same. So in your distance from subject images, you changed the focal length of the lens, as well as perhaps the distance from subject. That I can't tell. But the image on the left was made with the lens at 55 millimeters, and the next one was made with it at 20 millimeters. And the set works very well for changing the focal length of the lens. Okay, and these are from the focal length of the lens set. The image on the left made with 55 millimeter lens, and the one on the right 25 millimeters. So and they work well for the assignment. But you need to kind of decide which are for which, and also for the aperture, stay in the same place with the same focal length of the lens, and just change the size of the aperture with respect to depth of field. Of course, you need to change the shutter speed as well to compensate for the change in the amount of light when you change the aperture. Okay, thank you, Jessica. Okay, Stevie, let's take a look at your images. I lightened up this one image because it was almost impossible to see anything because the foreground was so dark. I'll bring it back to the original in a moment, but I think you misunderstood the assignment. The assignment was to, by changing each of the things that affect depth of field, showing us examples of how that works. So these are all listed as aperture, and I just wanted you to do aperture in one set and keep the aperture a constant in the other two sets. So this is labeled as aperture number 1, and the aperture does change from f5 to f9, which actually is not much of a change. And since everything is far away, it's difficult to see a change in the depth of field. Not impossible. So at F5, you can see the background is out of focus. At F9, it's a little harder to tell because there's nothing in the extreme foreground the way there is here. Okay. But beautiful, beautiful, beautiful light. So in the second set, they're both beautiful images, but all that you've changed is the aperture, not the focal length of the lens or distance from subject. In the third set, the aperture stays the same, and the focal length does as well. So it looks as if you changed the distance from subject a little bit. Okay. So beautiful images, but as I said, I think you perhaps misread or misunderstood the assignment. So go ahead and reread the assignment, and you're welcome to resubmit the images. Okay, thanks. All right, Jared, let's take a look at your images. So these were submitted for aperture. You definitely changed the aperture from f20 to f5.6, quite a difference. And the image on the left is very dark. We can see that the image on the right has shallow depth of field, as one would expect, with an aperture of f5.6. One thing I'm not quite sure what was going on here is the fact that the one image is much darker than the other. So the image on the right was shot at 60th of a second at f5.6, which is fine. The exposure bias, though, is set to 2 EV, which means that technically it overexposed by 2 stops, which I wouldn't say is necessarily the case, maybe by 1 stop. And in the first image, I guess, with the aperture at f20, it's way too dark, and it says that the exposure bias was set to 2 3/4 stops. So you want the EV to be at 0 generally. So go ahead and check that. Let's see what's going on. So for distance and focal length, used a car. I would like you to have used different subjects. It's a little difficult to see a change in the depth of field. I think your vantage point works nicely with the car when you came in closer. But it's, we're still not really getting a clear sense of the depth of field. When I come in very close, I can see that the depth of field is not shallow. It's pretty great, and that's in part because, because you're still not that close to the subject, and you're using a very wide-angle lens, 18 millimeters, and f8 is not a particular, it's not a really small aperture, it's not a really large aperture. In the far away, great distance image, it's impossible really to see a change in the depth of field because everything is far away. So beyond about 20 feet or so, if everything's beyond 20 feet, you are not going to see much of a change in the depth of field. And focal length of the lens, you changed from 18 millimeters to 55, which is not a huge difference, but definitely enough to see a change in the depth of field if you're closer to the subjects. So this is at 55 millimeter lens, and then this one with 18, and it looks as if something was going on with the focus. It's kind of fuzzy overall, so you might want to check that out. And again, your exposure biases are off, so go ahead and set that to 0. Okay, and if you want to redo the images, great. I'm happy to see them. All right, thanks.